Sharon was appointed by Begin to be the head of the Ministerial Committee on Settlements. Sharon was charged by Begin with two things. One, to create facts on the ground, settlements, roads, infrastructure, everything. Facts on the ground that make it impossible to disconnect Judea and Samaria from Israel, to make Israel's presence irreversible, and secondly, to foreclose forever the establishment of a Palestinian state. You can't explain the major elements of the occupation by security. You can't explain 200 settlements by security. Israel did not go out and build Ma'ale Adumim for security reasons, and it never claimed to. You can't explain the highway system. You can't explain the policy of house demolitions. You can't explain land expropriation. You can't explain really the closure, the way it's done, because most of the closure is internal, within the West Bank and within Gaza, not between them and Israel. And you can't explain the route of the wall by security. Security simply does not explain these things. Something else is going on.
אהלן, 11:08, הגענו לשלב הרגוע של הבוקר, זה שכבר סוף סוף אין בו דיווחי תנועה, זה שאפשר להתרווח בו, כמובן בדרך כלל אתם באמצע העבודה, אבל זה בסדר, אפשר להתרווח קצת, וליהנות מהמוזיקה שלנו במהלך השעה הקרובה. אני מזמינה אתכם.
אוקיי, זה כביש 443, בין ירושלים לתל אביב. דרך טובה לכל אלה שרוצים לברוח מכביש מספר 1, שחרר קצת הפקקים.
הוא גם כביש נוח לנסיעה. אין פה כביש, רובו ישר, לא עיקולים, לא זה, והוא כביש מאוד נוח לנסיעה וגם מקצר, נדמה לי ב7 קילומטר לבירה.
כביש מספר 1 מלא עליות, סיבובים, ירידות, זה כביש ממש נוח מבחינת מהירות. הבעיה אצלו זה שהוא עובר דרך השטחים, ממש ליד.
עכשיו הוא סגור להם, לא יכולים לנסוע בקטע הזה, אין להם אפשרות. כל היציאות, תשים לב, מהמחסום, כולם חסומות. כל היציאות חסומות. עכשיו יש להם כביש מקביל. פה כבישים מקבילים לכביש הזה.
الوضع سيء، إذا مش سيء جدا. لأنه أول إيش طبيعة الطريق مش كويسة، والمسافة طبعا بتلعب دور في الشغل، والأعداد قليلة. طبيعة الشغل قليلة. الأسباب طبيعة المسافة بتحكم الناس إنها ما تروحش وتيجي. يعني اللي بده يطلع مشوار على رام الله بحسب 20 مرة قبل ما يطلع على رام الله. أنا لما بده يطلع بده يوم كامل وهو رايح جاي على رام الله. بده ساعة وإشي ليصل، ساعة ليرجع، ولا يستنى تتعب، بده نص نهار وهو بس في موضوع المواصلات، موضوع السير.
هذا الوضع ما كانش دايما.
لا طبعا ما كانش، كان 10 دقائق فقط لا غير، 10 12 دقيقة. احنا شوفرية كنا نجيبها في 12 دقيقة نبقى جوا رام الله.
ما شوف بدي اقول لك وضع البلد صعب جدا من جميع النواحي.
هذا تحت الارض حتى ما نمشيش على الشارع الرئيسي، يعني الشارع الرئيسي بيكون من هنا وفوق. احنا حاليا تحت الشارع الرئيسي، دخلنا تحت الشارع الرئيسي اللي كنا نسلكه طوال الفترة السابقة قبل الانتفاضة. هو مش ممر، هو عبارة عن عبارة اصلا، وفي المية في الشتاء بيكون فايض حوالي نص متر ما نقدرش نمرته. احيانا كثيرة ما نقدرش نمرته.
اليوم طبر على القرى بتلاقي من جميع النواحي واقفة، من جميع النواحي. وضع صعب جدا جدا جدا، احنا لحقنا في الفترة هذه. مش عارف الواحد شو بده يسوي، احنا بنقول كل يوم ان شاء الله بتحسن الوضع، كل يوم على الفاضي. يوم عن يوم قاعدة بتسوء، قاعد بخرب الوضع يوم عن يوم.
יש איזו כוונה לסלול גם רכבת באיזשהו שלב על הציר הזה. הציר הזה בכל מקרה, גם בכל הסדר הוא יישאר בידינו. הוא יהיה מוקף חומה כביש הזה. שים לב, חומות עוברות מימין ומשמאל. זה יהיה בגדול.
These settlements, along with their bypass road network and security zones, occupy about 42% of the land designated for the future Palestinian state. New road construction throughout the world generally means growth and better accessibility. In contrast, roads between settlements can only be travelled by settlers. For Palestinians to drive on these roads, they must obtain special permits, which are extremely hard to get. The basic human right of freedom of movement within one's own country has been taken away from the majority of Palestinians and considered a privilege for a select few.
Here's where the highway system feeds in and the whole infrastructure, because you create a landscape in which, you're in Ma'ale Adumim, in the middle of the West Bank. Well, but with a beautiful highway, you can go to Ma'ale Adumim, you can go home and back, you work in Jerusalem, home and back in 15 minutes, with a beautiful highway, never encounter an Arab, never, God forbid, you never go through an Arab village or neighborhood or anything else. You stay completely in a Jewish-Israeli environment. So you come from Jewish Jerusalem, you go down the beautiful Jewish highway, through a Jewish landscape of the land of Israel, which is all idyllic because you don't see Arabs. You get into your Jewish dormitory suburb, go to your Jewish swimming pool at the end of the day, and everything is normal. It's banal. It's not an issue. It's not political at all.
Hi, my name is Anna, and I'm here to tell you about my experiences working with a group called the International Women's Peace Service, which is based in the West Bank, and basically we do two things. First of all, we're there to document human rights abuses in the region, and second of all, we're there to support nonviolent resistance to the occupation. I'm a Jewish American, and I originally got into this work when I was living in Turkey, and I would take trips through the Middle East during my vacations. I was in Iran, in Syria, and Lebanon, and along my way I was taken in by families, many of them Palestinian refugees, and through my friendships with these people that I met along the way, I began to hear for the first time a whole different sort of version of the history and present of Israel and Palestine, utterly different from anything that I'd ever learned growing up as a Jewish American. And I was very disturbed, alarmed by what I heard. I didn't believe it. I thought it was all propaganda. But it sort of planted a seed, and I began to do some of my own research and eventually decided to go to Palestine to see with my own eyes what was happening. And that's when I took my first trip to Palestine. And people are always asking me, Anna, why are Palestinians always resisting with bombs? Why are they always strapping bombs to themselves, trying to kill as many Israelis as possible? Why don't they use nonviolent resistance, like Martin Luther King talked about, like Gandhi talked about? Where are those things happening? Well, the answer is that Palestinians are and have been using nonviolent resistance, not just once in a while, not just here and there, but literally almost every second of almost every single day of their lives. Just think about it for a moment. Think about Munira and her family. Simply staying in their home. Simply saying, look, you've taken our land, you've taken our freedom, but you will not take our home, is a kind of resistance, and it is nonviolent. This is nonviolent resistance. Think about the villagers of Yanun who've come back to their homes and their land. They know that they could be beaten up, they know that they could even be killed by the settlers, but they also know that it is their right to be in their homes, on their land, and they're coming back to defend that right. This is nonviolent resistance. And in my opinion, any attempt on the part of Palestinians to maintain any kind of normalcy or dignity in their daily lives in spite of this occupation is a kind of resistance to that system. It's just not something you ever hear about in the newspapers and media. And here's a couple other examples of everyday nonviolent resistance in Palestine. Here's a group of women from the Tulkarm region who've been cut off from their trees by the wall. They've lost their livelihoods, so they've formed an embroidery cooperative to sell embroidery to support themselves and their families. Instead of giving up, instead of leaving, this is nonviolent resistance. This is the village of Atawani, where settlers have actually boiled barley seeds in rat poison and spread that poison around the landscape of Atawani to try and dissuade shepherds from bringing their sheep to their land for fear that the sheep will eat the poison and be killed. Well, I talked to the shepherd, and she knew about the poison, but she also knew that if she doesn't come back to her land, then the settlers would have gotten exactly what they wanted, and over time they would have come and confiscated the land, saying, well, nobody else was using it. So she's coming back to defend her right to be on her land, even if she might lose a sheep or two. This is nonviolent resistance. Painting the wall, nonviolent resistance. Climbing the wall is nonviolent resistance. Here's a young boy who's building his own roadblock out of rocks and wire that he found in his village. And he told me, Anna, I'm going to build a roadblock so that the jeeps can't raid my village tonight. This is nonviolent resistance. And finally, demonstrations are a kind of resistance happening almost daily in Palestine. We just don't hear very much about them, where communities of Palestinians will march down to the land that is being threatened. Here you can see a farmer trying to explain to the soldiers that have been placed there to basically protect the bulldozers that are uprooting the trees. He's trying to explain to them that the trees being uprooted belong to him and his family and have for generations. This is something else you might see at a demonstration, Palestinians who've come together to pray on their land. And I find it particularly moving, given that for many of these Palestinians, this could be their last chance to ever be on their land. And they're choosing to spend these final moments together as a community in silence, in worship on their land. Now, although most of these demonstrations are primarily peaceful, they are often met with a great deal of violence from the soldiers who throw tear gas or sound bombs. There are sometimes rubber bullets or even live ammunition used against nonviolent demonstrators. There is also sometimes violence from the Palestinian side. Here you can see a picture of a Palestinian boy who's picked up a stone and is throwing it at Israeli soldiers and jeeps at a demonstration. And I include it not because stone throwing has anything to do with my work with IWPS, it doesn't, but first of all because it is the reality. There are stones thrown at these demonstrations. And second of all, to give it a little bit of perspective. So the stone throwing that you see here is used as the justification for the mass imprisonment of young Palestinian men who are put in jail for throwing these stones. And well, I would agree that a stone is definitely a weapon, right? You know, you can kill somebody with a stone, no question about it, but we don't get much sort of context in which these stones are actually thrown. So for example, this boy, he hasn't sort of gathered up a bunch of stones and snuck across the border into Israel to stone as many Israelis as possible because he hates Jews. This boy is in his village, and he's watching jeeps and bulldozers surround his village, uproot his trees, and build a wall around his community. And he's picking up a stone and throwing it at those jeeps, at those bulldozers. And I guess I would just ask you, if someone were to come into your home and start carrying out your television, and then your stereo, and then your computer, at one point, would you pick up a lamp and throw it at them? It's not about justifying, it's about being realistic. What would you expect of yourself in that situation, and how does it compare to what you expect of the Palestinians in the situation they're in right now with the wall? Like I said, many of these kids end up in jail. Here are 5 kids from the village of Marda, near where I lived, and a jeep was raiding their village one night, and they threw stones at the jeep. No soldiers were hurt. In fact, very few soldiers have actually been hurt by these stones because they're usually thrown from very far away for fear of being arrested. And in fact, these 5 kids were picked up for stone throwing and put into jail for 6 months. More than 340 Palestinian children and 9,500 adult Palestinian political prisoners are being held in Israeli prisons today. More than 10% of these are what are called administrative detainees, which means that they can be held without charge indefinitely.
I came to look at the aftermath of a place where 25 greenhouses had been demolished on the other side of Rafah, destroying the livelihoods of about 300 people, and that had taken place while they rounded up about 150 men, held them under a sniper tower, and shot around them to contain the men, the farmers in the area. So I feel like what I'm witnessing here is a very systematic destruction of people's ability to survive, and that is incredibly horrifying. It's incredibly horrifying.